your screen now is Professor Robert Auerbach. He is a professor of public affairs at the University of Texas's LBJ School. Professor Auerbach is also the author of this book, Deception and Abuse at the Fed, Henry B. Gonzalez Battles Alan Greenspan's Bank. First of all, Professor Auerbach, who was Henry Gonzalez, for those who may not know?
He was the first Mexican-American to be elected from Texas to the U.S. Congress. He was also in the Senate here, and he's from San Antonio.
And he was chairman of the House Banking Committee for a long time, a Democrat, correct?
Chairman of the House Banking Committee, that's correct.
And what was his relationship with the various Fed chairs?
He was cordial, but he kept them at arm's length because he believes that the Banking Committee has a duty to oversee the Federal Reserve. So he would not go to lunch with them or dinner, but he would investigate them to make sure that they were doing what they're supposed to do.
And what is the premise of your book, Deception and Abuse at the Fed, particularly when it comes to Alan Greenspan?
Right. Let me just mention that I've worked at the Federal Reserve for 2 years, and although some of the things I say are critical, they're very good people at the Federal Reserve. I worked at the Kansas City Federal Reserve with Donald Cohn, who became vice chairman of the Fed, very good public official. And I was at the Congress for 11 years working for the Democrats, and I worked originally under Henry Royce from Milwaukee. During the 90s, I worked with Henry B. Gonzalez from San Antonio. I knew him very well in the 70s, and he asked me to come back and help him after he was elected chair. And I worked in the Reagan administration. And it's kind of interesting because I received my PhD from Milton Friedman and worked for the Democrats. And I might add that both sides of the aisle are very interested in my book. Just earlier this month, on October 4th, Congressman Ron Paul has a subcommittee now of the Financial Services Committee, and he asked me to come and testify.
So, but getting back, what was Henry Gonzalez, what was his beef with Alan Greenspan?
When I came there, we just decided he had no beef with him, although he just had investigated other things like the Keating Five. When I got there and returned to the Congress in '92, he said, look, I don't care if they're Democrats, Republicans, if they're doing something wrong, let me know. He had just done the Keating Five, for which he received the Kennedy Award. I went with him up to the Kennedy Library when he received it. And he said, all I want to do is have full investigations of the Fed. So the book is primarily on the investigations in which I assisted. I was with Henry the last day he was in his office before he left, and he actually wrote a letter here that they should hire me, along with Milton Friedman. So I had...
If you could walk us through one of those investigations.
Yeah, I'd like to mention a few that people would be interested
Sure.
in. First of all, when you say Federal Reserve, people yawn. But the Federal Reserve is the most powerful peacetime bureaucracy in the United States. It controls the money supply. It regulates all the major banks and it appropriates money for foreign governments without permission of the Congress since 1962. And so I'd just like to mention some of the things people could read about in the book, and maybe you'd be interested in them. First is the chapter called The 17-Year Lie. 1976, Arthur Burns decided, because of laws that were then being passed and because of suits against the Fed, he would tell the world that they would no longer have transcripts of their policy-making committee. It's called the Federal Open Market Committee. No transcripts, no journalists can file FOIA requests. They don't exist. 1992, when I came back, and Chairman Gonzalez liked to be called Henry B., as he's called in San Antonio. Henry B. said, I said to him, this is the major central bank in the world and they don't have records? How is that possible? So on October 19th, 1993, we called Alan Greenspan, the 7 members of the Board of Governors, and the presidents of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. They all sat in a long row in front of Henry B. And we tried to find out if they have records of that meeting. They misled us. But finally, the Cleveland Fed broke after Henry told me to put a lot of pressure on them and tell them they were federal witnesses and they shouldn't mislead us, and told us they had a meeting 5 days before, which is now up on the internet for people to read. And at that meeting they decided how to mislead us so we wouldn't discover the transcripts. So then Henry B. got extremely upset about that, and Alan Greenspan knew it. He sent a messenger over, and I rushed the letter up to Henry B. And Henry said, "Bob, go over there and look at those transcripts that they've been hiding for 17 years, lying about." So I did take a group of Republican and Democratic staffers over to the office. There were some big arguments over there, but we demanded to see the transcripts or we'd go get a subpoena. And they were right around the corner from Alan Greenspan's office, 17 years of Federal Reserve transcripts neatly typed that they had lied about for 17 years. But then, after I came down here, and I came to Texas in 1998, right after our hearing, the Fed decided, well, we'll start publishing the transcripts with a 5-year lag. Well, I got them down here in 91, and I discovered that in 1995, the Fed decided to start destroying, shredding their source transcripts, which had been sent to the National Archives after 30 years. They started shredding them. So I wrote to Alan Greenspan, "Why are you doing this?" And he had his assistant, who was my friend, Don Cohn, sent me a letter, which I put up on Huffington Post if anybody wants to read it. And he said, "Yes, we've decided to destroy the Fed source records, but we think it's legal." I believe that's going on right now, and I think that's a very bad situation. Then one of the interesting things that we did, the Congress got word that the first Bush administration had sent Saddam Hussein $5.5 billion in an agricultural loan. It was issued through a tiny Italian bank in Atlanta, Georgia. And the only one that really was arrested for it was the poor manager of that bank, Christopher Drugel. And I had him brought to my office, came in chains from the prison, put him in a suit, and he appeared before Henry B. And Henry said, "Where was the Fed? They investigate all foreign banks operating in the United States." He said, "Well, the examiner came in, looked at some of the Georgia records, and then we had a cup of espresso." And there's more to that story, but I wrote it in my book. Then, during the 1990s, we saw something that is part of the problem we're having now with the major banks in New York. The Congress got information that the officers of the New York Federal Reserve Bank that examined some of the biggest banks in the country were taking gifts. Henry said, "Get after them right away," and we started an investigation. And you can read about it in the book. Finally, the president, Gerald Corrigan, of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, wrote Henry a letter and said, "Look, sometimes they take a few meals and a literal handful," that's a direct quote from his letter, "of sporting tickets." Well, Henry hit the ceiling on that one and did cause, because they're supposed to be investigating it, and the information we got, it's kind of a joke. And that's probably why banks like Citibank had near $50 billion off their main records. Where were the examiners from the Fed? Were they dining out with the people they're investigating? Then we got information that the Los Angeles branch of the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, which has much of the currency that comes into the Fed vaults of the 12 banks store all the new currency from the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, as well as all the money that the banks don't want to hold on their premises. They all ship it to Federal Reserve banks. And a public number that he put on our press release, I can use it, is that they had $80 billion in cash there. And we got information that the accounting records there were corrupt. So we sent in a GAO team, and they published a report, which I put in my book. It was just a terrible report about people going in to all the records and changing them, and they were all messed up, and also on some reports forcing a balance so the books look balanced. After we did that, Alan Greenspan sent in a huge group from the Board of Governors, and they spent a weekend counting the money in the vault. I don't know how they could count all that in a weekend, and he said there wasn't a dollar missing. But the problem is the bookkeeping in those vaults. If the other banks do that, that is now a national security problem, as I told Chairman Ron Paul, and should be audited. Then let me talk a little about one chapter people will be interested in. It's called When 500 Economists Are Not Enough. That's how many worked at the Federal Reserve, and more than 500. I worked there. Many of them are excellent. But the Federal Reserve also sends into economists and academia money. During the investigation I did for Henry, the Fed was forced to turn over all the contracts. Some economists had contracts with as many as 5 different Federal Reserve banks. And they were sending lots of money into anyone in the country that was interested in money and banking. Those are future witnesses for the Congress. Milton Friedman gave an interview to Reuters after he heard from me and said this is very detrimental to having good analysis of what the Fed's doing, having them all on the payroll. And then people will be interested in the myth of political virginity. That's one of the chapters in my book. The Fed always says we're independent from politics. Well, they're not. They always have their lobbyists going around the Congress. In 1976, when Henry Royce tried to get an audit bill, they got all the bankers they regulate, told them to go to Washington, and they were very effective, and they blocked the bill for 2 years. Now the auditors are limited. They can't audit the parts of the Fed that have to do with monetary policy or international relations, where we found a lot of problems.
And we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Auerbach, okay. I'm afraid. You've been listening to Robert Auerbach talk about his book, Deception and Abuse at the Fed. Is the subtitle, Henry B. Gonzalez.